Wait for the little ding. And there's the little ding. So, um, yeah, covering. So, sailing terms are sucks just under the surface. Biological reefs are sometimes called bioherms, and they're not necessarily all found in shallow water. So there's a difference between what a reef is to a sailor and a reef to a biologist. And you can have very deep water biological reefs that no ship is ever going to be able to run into. What makes a biological reef a reef is that it's made by organisms that have skeletons. And old skeletons can serve as a foundation for the growth of new organisms with skeletons. So over time, with dead skeletons serving as the basis for new generations, reefs kind of grow in concentric layers. They can be, in some cases, thousands of feet thick as new grows on top of the old. And so reefs can actually be made of a wide range of different organisms. This is a picture taken in deep water that's, 194 meters, so that's about 600 feet off the Pacific coast of British Columbia. You can see those grayish white, kind of stubby things with fingers on them. That's a type of sponge called hexactinellids, aka glass sponges. And these deep sea sponges make a biological reef, growing on top of each other and new ones growing on top of the silica skeletons of the old. And these were only discovered back in 1987. This is way too deep for scuba diving. So it wasn't until we got some remotely operated cameras and submersibles down there that we were able to see them. But yeah, you can have deep sea reefs like this, and they're not necessarily made up of corals. This one's made of sponges. This one is made of tube-building segmented worms. Those of you in parasitology, I talked about these this morning. There are segmented worms, distant cousins of earthworms, that live permanently in tube-shaped structures that they build themselves, that they'll either secrete from their bodies or glue together out of sand grains or something like that. And they'll live in those tubes and stick out tentacles to feed. And if you ever go to a pet store that's got a good marine department, they may have things called peacock worms or feather duster worms or Christmas tree worms on sale. That's those segmented worms that live permanently in tubes. And at Bathtub Beach, Florida, there's an entire reef made of segmented worms in a family called the Sabellariidae. I did not take this picture, but I've actually seen something like this once when I was in Baja California, Mexico, poking around at a little fishing camp called, I think it was San Francisquito on the Gulf of California. There was actually a little reef at very shallow water made up of tube-building segmented worms. You can even have reefs made up of algae. These are some red algae of a type called coralline algae because they secrete calcium carbonate. They make these big chalky skeletons. And certain red algae that can do this, and also certain green algae, can secrete enough of a calcium carbonate skeleton that they can be an important part of the biological framework of a reef. Even coral reefs might be dominated by corals, but there may be quite a lot of algae in there as well, mixed in with the corals and helping to build that biological framework. So you can have algae reefs There's still at least a couple of places where you have blue-green bacterial reefs, like Shark Bay, Australia, and you can have worm reefs and sponge reefs, and there's at least one case of a snail reef that I can think of. There's lots of different reefs, but the most common type of reef that, the most thing that people most usually think of when they think of a reef as a coral reef, and those are restricted to the tropics, between about 23 degrees north and south of the equator. Maybe a tiny bit more north, not very much. The nearest shallow water coral reefs to us would be off the southernmost tip of Florida, and actually a few places in the Gulf of Mexico where the water happens to be shallow. And those are laid down by true corals. True corals are members of the phylum Cnidaria. That's the things that sting people. So they're related to jellyfish and such. The soft body is kind of like a sea anemone. The body's basically bag-like. There's only one way into the stomach. That's the mouth. That's also the way that waste has to come out. The mouth is surrounded by tentacles. The overall body is shaped more or less like a cylinder. And in a sea anemone, there's just one polyp, one of these cylinder-shaped bodies with tentacles and a mouth. In sea anemones, those are single. In true corals, they're connected by sheets of tissue called cenosarc, which is Greek for common flesh. So you'll have a whole sheet of polyps that are all connected at the base by these sheets of cenosarc. And then each below the cenosarc secretes calcium carbonate. And underneath each polyp, there is a cavity into which the polyp can retract. And the cavity itself may have little cross walls called sclerosepta. If you will excuse me for just a moment, I might actually have the wherewithal for a quick demonstration of this, because I think I've got up here, hang on. Hang on. Okay, when I was a kid, we went on a Hawaiian vacation, and we should not have done this, but my mom picked up a few pieces of coral off, and I'm going to pause presenting for just a moment. And okay, what am I actually doing here? Okay, I'm recording. I'm still recording. Right, I'm assuming everybody can see me. And she picked up some coral, and she probably should not have done so, but it was the early 80s, and took it home as a souvenir. And this little piece of it's gotten a little dusty, but if my camera will show this, okay, I think that shows it fairly well. You should be able to see the... Yeah, type me to see if you can see this. You see how the surface of this chunk of coral has a bunch of little hexagon-shaped depressions, right? It's got this almost regular set of little depressions on there. Each one of those is a corallite, and each one of those little depressions is where a coral would have been, a coral polyp. And all of the polyps would have been connected into one sheet of tissue that laid all of this down. And underneath each individual polyp, you would have had one of these kind of polygonally shaped little depressions, a corallite. Okay, I don't know entirely how clear this is, but I will hope that that is, and then I'll go back to the presentation. But yeah, you very briefly were able to get a little um, quasi-live demo of what this is supposed to look like. Okay. Right. Yeah, by the way, from it as a souvenir. That's not nice and probably illegal. But it was 1981 and people weren't quite so uptight about that sort of thing. Okay, right. You can get corals. They belong to a subgroup called the Scleractinia, and you can get Scleractinians that don't form reefs. So here on the left and a little bit lower down, you've got a living solitary coral, and to the right, that round thing is a dead solitary coral. The actual tissue is gone, but you can see the corallite. You can see that ring-shaped skeleton that the thing laid down when it was alive. And solitary Scleractinians like that don't build up reefs, and they're not restricted to the tropics. You can find some of these at great depths. Somewhere I've actually got the remains of somebody's baseball cap that looks like it floated around the Gulf of Mexico for a couple of years before washing up on shore. And it's actually got some solitary coral skeletons growing on it, but they don't form a big stony mass like a reef-building coral would. Okay, so there's some reef-building corals, and those are alive, and you can see those green little circles covering that coral colony. Those are individual polyps. And colonial corals that lay down lots of calcium carbonate are major contributors to a reef growth, and we say that they're hermatypic. Herm means a reef in this case, and typic is like typical. None of this would be possible without symbionts. On the right, that's a type of coral where the individual corallites actually fuse together into these long chains. That's called a meandroid coral, otherwise known as a brain coral. And it looks kind of yellow-green. The yellow-green area is living tissue covering the surface of this brain coral. And it's green because the living tissue is jam-packed full of single-celled photosynthetic protists called dinoflagellates. You might remember we talked about those way back when we were talking about plankton. There are some dinoflagellates that are bioluminescent. You might remember we saw that picture of people kayaking off the coast of Vieques Island in Puerto Rico, and the ocean was glowing blue. That's made by dinoflagellates. But there's an entire genus of dinoflagellates, genus Symbiodinium, that spends its entire life living inside the tissues of corals, and actually in some other marine organisms as well, giant clams, for instance. And the dinoflagellates get a place to live, and they get to consume the coral's carbon dioxide waste. And the coral periodically harvests these symbiotic algae as a source of food, and neither one could live very long without the other. The dinoflagellates are specifically called zooxanthellae. Xantho, X-A-N-T-H, just means yellow or yellow-green. Zoox means an animal. So zooxanthellae are yellow-green things in an animal. And shallow reef-building corals depend on these. That means that to have a coral reef, you have to have lots of sunlight, which is what restricts coral reefs to the tropics. This is why you don't get tropical-style coral reefs off the coast of Maine. And that means also that the water must be clear and relatively shallow. You're not going to get tropical style coral reefs at great depth, nor are you going to get them in places like the South Louisiana coast, which conceivably might be warm and sunny enough, but you're not going to get reefs because the rivers are dumping too much sediment into the water and it's too murky for you to get development of true corals. When corals are under stress, usually by temperature, although sometimes other things, something goes wrong in the biochemical exchange between the host and the symbiont. The whole thing is pretty finely tuned. The symbionts take up carbon dioxide from the coral. They have to do it at a particular rate. If the rate falls out of whack, corals can respond by expelling their endosymbionts, and this is called coral bleaching. In the foreground, you can see some staghorn coral that is mostly bleached. You see how it looks white. In the background, you can see some more colonies that are starting to get bleached at the tips. You can see most of the tissue is still green, but the tips are looking increasingly light in color. Bleaching isn't fatal for the corals, and corals can recover from it, but corals that have bleached are under a great deal of stress, and they're vulnerable. They're likely to die, even if it doesn't happen immediately upon bleaching. And if you ever want to see a tropical coral reef, you probably ought to go now, or at least in a few years, because coral bleaching has been happening at record rates all over the tropics for the past 2 decades. Bleaching is not the only cause, but I just read a news report a couple of days ago that half the coral on Australia's Great Barrier Reef is dead. And it's not that corals don't die anyway, but it's been happening. There's been coral death more than coral birth. Coral death has exceeded coral growth for some time, and part of the reason is increased rates of bleaching. Now, global warming is, of course, a hoax invented by the Chinese, but if they were right, I would have to say that global warming is contributing to this because heat stress is a problem for corals and their symbionts. For the record, I'm being sarcastic about the Chinese. We'll actually look later at global climate and what it's doing to the oceans. We'll look at this in more detail. This makes it surprising that you actually can get deep water coral reefs, and these had not been studied nearly as much because they're a lot harder to visit. Tropical coral reefs you could walk on, and you could certainly explore by skin diving and scuba diving. These reefs that you're looking at are off the coast of Norway, off some islands called the Lofoten Islands. They grow much more slowly. Some of these reefs are 8,000 years old or more. They are a fragile habitat because once damaged, it will take them a very long time to recover. And so they're at risk from bottom trawling. That's a form of fishing where you basically drag a big net over the bottom. And off the coast of Norway in the North Sea, there is also a lot of oil drilling going on. And these ecosystems are at risk. But yeah, these are several hundred to several thousand feet down, and the corals don't have zooxanthellae because there isn't any light. And there's a close-up. The coral is called Lophelia. You can see how they branch. Each one of those round things that looks like the cut-off end of a branch is a corallite. And they may be home to over 1,200 other species, including economically valuable fish, and probably crustaceans as well. I bet I could eat that crustacean that's walking on the coral. So you can have deep-sea coral reefs and deep-sea sponge reefs in addition to the tropical ones. But I'm going to talk about tropical-type coral reefs for the rest of our time. Ring-shaped reefs in the open ocean are called atolls. And it's one of the funny things, if you go looking in the tropical Pacific or the tropical Indian Ocean, there are a sizable number of islands that are made up mostly of corals and coral rubble and coral sand that are very low in elevation and have a lagoon in the center. They're shaped like irregular rings. Those are coral atolls, and we'll talk about how those form in just a bit. Coastal reefs follow the coastline of a larger landmass, and platform reefs are broad reefs. They've got a complicated architecture, and they're not necessarily close to a coast. We'll talk about those in a bit. If you want a nice example of a platform reef, there's actually a spot in the Gulf of Mexico where there's an undersea hill. It's a type called a salt dome that gets shallow enough that there's a tropical type coral reef that's built up on the top of it. It's called Flower Garden Banks, and it's not close to the coast. In fact, corals can't grow close to the coast because there's too much mud in the water. But if you ever get a chance to go scuba diving on Flower Garden Banks, I'm told it's absolutely lovely. And that would be a platform reef, broad, not close to a coast, and pretty complicated in the way it's put together. And so with coastal reefs, you can have little patches of corals surrounded by sand, and we call those patch reefs. On a subtidal coast, you can have a narrow layer of corals called a fringing reef that's close to the coast. And then if you have a wide lagoon between the reef and the land, you've got a barrier reef, as in the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. So, Mike, let's look at these. We'll look at atolls first. There's Mauna Kea, Hawaii in the foreground with Mauna Loa in the background. Mauna Kea is the largest mountain on Earth. It's over 13,000 feet above sea level, but then it goes 20,000 feet below sea level all the way down to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. That's all one volcano, or actually a bunch of volcanoes that are glommed together, making up the big island of Hawaii. So yes, we do have snow-capped mountains in Hawaii, and it is possible to go skiing in the morning and surfing in the afternoon if you're so minded. So there's Mauna Kea. That's a volcano in the middle of the ocean, and partly because of erosion, these islands get lower and lower over time, you know, not day to day, but over the space of many thousands of years. They get lower, partly because they erode, and partly because the Earth's crust will actually flex under a heavy weight put on it. You can actually have a pile of rock on top of the Earth's crust that is heavy enough that it will actually cause the crust to sink down. That's called isostasy, by the way. So Mauna Kea, Hawaii is an enormous volcanic island. In about 10 million years, it may look like this. Mauna Kea may end up looking like Gardner Pinnacles in the Pacific Ocean, which are 6 acres, 170 feet tall, and covered in bird shit. Given a sufficiently long time, this is what Mauna Kea is going to turn into. And this was worked out, oddly enough, by a fellow you might have heard of by the name of Charles Darwin, who cruised around the world as part of the crew of a British naval ship, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, between 1831 and 1836. You've probably heard that he visited some islands called the Galapagos. You may have heard that he, made some discoveries that would end up becoming important for his theory of evolution. The other thing he did on that voyage that he's famous for is making observations on tropical coral islands. And he worked out a theory for how they formed, which turned out to be right, but wasn't conclusively demonstrated until the 1950s. But it goes like this. Here you've got a volcanic island in the sea, and around the edges of that island, you'll get corals starting to grow in the shallows, and they'll form what we call a fringing reef. Once the volcano stops growing and starts eroding and sinking, as the island sinks, the coral grows upwards, right? The coral can't grow completely out of the water, but if the reef sinks, then new coral growth is going to tend to push it up. And so that fringing reef is going to spread out and become a barrier reef. And eventually the entire island may end up completely underneath sea level. But what you'll have left is coral growth still in that ring shape around the central peak of that island that doesn't exist anymore. And once you've done that, you've got an atoll, a ring-shaped coral island with a central lagoon in the center of it. So it'll start looking like this. That's a satellite picture of the island of Moorea in French Polynesia. This, by the way, is the place where the University of California has its marine biology station that I would love to take all of you to one of these days. All we need is for some millionaire to give us a few $1,000,000 and tell us to have fun. You can see the area of the island itself. It's mostly in green because it's tropical and highly vegetated, and you can see mountains and canyons on the island. Surrounding it, you can see these very shallow areas that are kind of light turquoise. And then the rim around the whole thing is the fringing reef. Step off the fringing reef and it's 20,000 feet down to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. So what the fringing reef is growing on is the slopes of that volcanic island. And as the island sinks, the island will sink down, but the reef will keep growing upwards, and you end up with the fringing reef becoming a barrier reef. So this is where it's happened. This is the island of Bora Bora, and you can see the main island in the center. It's the green part. There's a couple of smaller islands surrounding it. But the fringing reefs become a barrier reef because you can see there's a pretty deep lagoon between the reef and the island itself. There's a lot more space, right? There's Moorea, and there's Bora Bora. You can see that lagoon building up. And then given enough time, you end up with something like this. This is Midway. Midway Island, famous because it was the site of one of the most important battles of World War II in the Pacific. And you don't have, I guess you have a little bit of coral sand right there, making up those flat islands that have runways on them. But aside from that, you just have that ring-shaped reef. There's no longer a central volcanic island at all, and we have an atoll. So Midway is an atoll, and so is Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. I think this is technically a United States possession. And you can see all you've got is this ring-shaped coral reef. There's a few buildups of coral sand and rubble, making up some small islands where the population actually lives. I don't think there's... Oh, wait, there's not a population, and we'll talk about why. Don't think Eniwetok has people on it anymore, but if there were, they'd live on some of those little bits of coral rubble on that ring, but you can't see any central peak at all. So you've gone from that, something like that, to something like that, to something like that. And as I mentioned, Darwin observed coral atolls in the Indian Ocean, and he developed basically this model of how they formed. So the parts that are shaded shows you what it looks like when you have I guess that's a barrier reef. You can see that you have the island in the center between the letters B prime and B prime. That's the island. And the barrier reef develops between the letters A prime and B prime. And then if the sea level either rises or the island sinks, the coral is just going to keep growing up and up and up. It'll eventually completely cover the old central volcanic island, and you end up with an atoll. Up at the top of that diagram, you're seeing a cross-section from A double prime to A double prime. His first book was an explanation of his theory. It's called On the Structure of Coral Reefs, and he basically got it right. The picture can be more complicated because sea level has not stayed steady throughout geologic history. There are times when it can go up and down, and that can complicate that simple picture of development that I talked about. But he fundamentally got the right idea. And his ideas were not confirmed until the early 1950s. Researchers were studying Eniwetok Atoll because we tested nuclear weapons at Eniwetok. In fact, if we go back to that map, if you look at the uppermost part of that island, right, at the topmost part of the island that you can see in the picture, you can see you've got the reef, it's got a pretty sharp outer edge, and then you've got shallows, reef flats back behind it. But you might notice that there's a couple of nearly circular holes right next to each other, very close to the uppermost part of that picture, holes in the reef flat. That's the remains of a couple of nuclear tests. I think this one was called Ivy Mike. And yeah, that's where we detonated a couple of nuclear weapons. And in preparation for these nuclear tests, researchers did an in-depth study of the geology of Eniwetok Atoll and drilled down very deeply to it. And they confirmed that if you drill down under that ring of coral, you get lots and lots of coral, but eventually you rock, the remains of what used to be that island that completely sunk under the surface of the ocean, over 4,000 feet down. So that basically confirmed the model that Darwin had proposed, that if you drill deeply enough under these atolls, you will eventually hit volcanic rock. That's what the initial coral reef grew on, maybe a couple million years previously. And then, of course, they nuked Eniwetok. So, yeah, there's Eniwetok right there. And you can have rising sea levels. If sea levels rise too high, the coral reef can be drowned. Remember that you have to have very shallow water because coral reefs need lots of sunlight to feed those symbionts that they've got. And if the sea level rises for any reason, growth can stop. The other thing that can happen is you can have, remember we talked about plate tectonics. What you see in the North Pacific is we have some old atolls that no longer grow because plate tectonic movements carried them out of the tropics. And an atoll in which there isn't any more coral growth will eventually erode completely below the surface. That'll form a seamount. And wave action can erode the top of the seamount to a very flat surface, forming a kind of table mountain under the sea. This particular one is not a coral seamount, because it's from the North Atlantic, but it shows you the shape of what these things look like. Such an undersea table mountain is called, I've always said it's a guyot. I think it's actually named after a American scientist who was from France, and his name was Arnold Guyot. So it probably should be pronounced Guyot, but I think what everybody says is a guyot. So atolls go through this life cycle where they'll start as fringing reefs around a volcano. As the volcano sinks and the reef grows up and up, it goes from being fringing to being barrier, and ultimately to an atoll, to a ring-shaped island with nothing left in the middle. And it might keep growing like that for quite a long time. And if growth ever stops, the island will erode below the surface and you end up with a seamount. So there. And that's what I got for you today. We started a little late and I seem to be finishing a little early. My slides seem to go faster when I'm talking this way, but I hope everybody got something out of it. And I will go ahead and stop the recording.